Her billionaire husband sent her to jail for his mistress, and he didn't even have the decency to look away while it happened. Isabella sat in the back of the police cruiser, the cold metal handcuffs digging into her wrists, staring up at the balcony of the home she had paid for. Marcus was standing there, dry and comfortable under the awning, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. He wasn't crying. He wasn't on the phone with his high-priced lawyers trying to fix a misunderstanding. He was smiling, and he wasn't alone. Standing right next to him, wearing a silk robe that Isabella recognized, was Jade. Marcus wrapped his arm around his mistress's waist and raised his glass in a mock toast toward the police car. He looked like a man who had just closed the deal of a lifetime, completely unbothered by the fact that he was shipping his wife off to federal prison just to make room for his new girlfriend. Before we watch Marcus lose his entire empire the very second she gets released, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. And here is a question for you. If you built a billion-dollar company for your spouse and they threw you in jail to steal it, would you forgive them, or would you take everything back? Let me know in the comments. The rain started to pound against the roof of the squad car, drowning out the sound of the camera shutters from the paparazzi gathered at the gate. It was a humiliating scene. To the rest of the world, this looked like justice. The news reports were already running the headline Marcus had fed them. Greedy wife caught selling secrets. They painted Isabella as a jealous, unstable woman who tried to sabotage her husband's company because she couldn't handle his success. It was a perfect story. It was simple, it was dramatic, and it was a complete lie. The truth was that Marcus was bored. He had become the face of Titan Motors, the Elon Musk of his generation, and he decided that a quiet, intelligent wife didn't fit his new brand. He wanted Jade, loud, aggressive, and willing to play the game. But Marcus had a problem. He couldn't just divorce Isabella. If they went to court, a judge would look at the assets. A judge might find out that Marcus didn't write a single line of code for the self-driving cars that made him a billionaire. A divorce would expose him as a fraud. So, he chose the evil option. He planted fake files on her computer, tipped off the FBI, and framed her for industrial espionage. He chose to lock her in a cage for 5 years rather than give her half of what she rightfully earned. As the police officer put the car in drive, Isabella watched Jade lean in and kiss Marcus on the cheek. It was a victory lap. They thought it was over. Marcus thought he had just taken out the trash. As the car pulled away, leaving the mansion behind, Isabella didn't scream or kick the seat. She just watched them celebrate. Marcus thought he was the smartest guy in the room. He viewed people like assets. Buy them when you need them, sell them when you don't. He thought that by sending Isabella away, he was securing his future. He believed he held the keys to the kingdom. But he was wrong. He didn't realize that Isabella wasn't just his wife. She was the architect. She was the only reason his cars worked. He thought he had severed ties with a liability, but he had actually just started a countdown. He didn't know that the system had a heartbeat, and by cutting her out, he had just triggered a kill switch that was buried deep in the code. He was toasting to his freedom, totally unaware that he was standing on top of a time bomb set to go off in exactly 5 years. To understand how Marcus could be so cruel, we have to go back 3 years, to a time when the world saw Isabella not as a criminal, but as the luckiest woman alive. They called her the Queen of Silicon Valley, but inside the walls of their sprawling glass mansion, she was treated more like a servant. The dynamic was painfully clear at every charity gala and launch party they attended. Marcus would hold court in the center of the room, loudly bragging about his vision for the future of transportation, while Isabella stood silently by his side, holding his coat. If a reporter ever tried to ask Isabella a question, Marcus would cut in immediately, laughing it off and saying that his wife didn't concern herself with the boring technical stuff. He would place a hand on her shoulder, squeezing just a little too hard, and joke that she was the beauty of the operation, implying that she didn't have the brains to contribute anything else. The public ate it up. They saw a brilliant, charismatic billionaire and his quiet, submissive trophy wife. They assumed she spent her days shopping and getting spa treatments while he saved the world. But the reality behind closed doors was vastly different. As soon as they got home from these events, Marcus would collapse on the sofa, exhausted from playing the genius, while Isabella went to work. She would retreat to her private study, a small room in the back of the house that Marcus rarely entered because he found it cluttered. He thought she was in there scrapbooking or planning dinner parties. He never bothered to check what was actually on her screens. If he had looked, he would have seen lines of complex code cascading down the monitors like a digital waterfall. While Marcus was the face of the company, Isabella was the brain. She was the one fixing the bugs in the navigation system that Marcus had promised investors were already solved. She was the one optimizing the battery efficiency algorithms that made Titan Motors famous. She was the silent engine keeping the entire machine running. Marcus loved the fame, the magazine covers, and the adoration, but he hated the actual work. He was a salesman, not an engineer. He relied on Isabella to make his wild promises come true, but he resented her for it. Every time she solved a problem he couldn't, it bruised his massive ego. He treated her like a child in public to compensate for the fact that, in private, he knew he was helpless without her. He built a golden cage around her, convinced that if he kept her small, she would never realize how powerful she actually was. The origin of their billion-dollar empire wasn't in a high-tech laboratory, but at a kitchen table in a cramped apartment where they lived before the fame. Back then, Marcus was just a guy with a charismatic smile and a PowerPoint presentation, pitching investors on an electric car that didn't exist yet. Isabella was the one staying up until 4 in the morning, drinking energy drinks and furiously typing on a secondhand laptop. She built Titan OS, the operating system that allowed the cars to drive themselves, entirely from scratch. She poured her soul into that code. It was her art. When the software finally worked, Marcus was ecstatic. He hugged her, spun her around, and told her they were going to change the world. But then came the paperwork. When it was time to incorporate the company, Marcus presented her with a stack of legal documents. He smiled that charming smile and told her it was just standard procedure to put everything in his name for liability reasons. He said it would protect her if anything went wrong. Isabella, blinded by love and trusting her husband implicitly, picked up the pen. But she didn't sign blindly. She was a coder, and coders are obsessed with details. She noticed that the contract gave Marcus full ownership of the company, but it listed her as the lead architect of the software. Marcus was so eager to get her signature that he didn't even read the technical addendum she had attached to the back of the agreement. He just wanted the rights. That arrogance was his first fatal mistake. In that technical addendum, Isabella had included a specific maintenance clause. It stated that the primary architect, her, had to personally authorize a security update for the system every 1,825 days, which is exactly 5 years. If that authorization didn't happen, the software would assume it had been compromised or stolen. It was a dead man's switch, a common failsafe in high-level programming to prevent theft. Isabella didn't add it to hurt Marcus. She added it because she wanted to protect their work from hackers. She assumed she would always be there to press the button. She never imagined that 5 years later, she would be sitting in a prison cell, watching the days tick down on a calendar, while Marcus lived in the house that code built, completely unaware that he was driving a car with no brakes toward a cliff edge. The cracks in their marriage didn't appear overnight. They walked through the front door in a pair of red stilettos. Enter Jade. She was hired as the new director of public relations for Titan Motors, and she was everything Isabella was not. Jade was loud, aggressive, and hungry for fame. She didn't care about engineering or safety protocols. She cared about headlines. From the moment she stepped into the office, she identified Marcus's weakness, his desperate need to be worshipped. She fed his ego constantly, telling him he was a god among men and that he deserved more than a quiet wife who stayed in the background. It started with late work dinners that Marcus claimed were unavoidable. Then came the weekends away for business conferences where no business was actually discussed. Isabella wasn't stupid. She saw the way Jade touched Marcus's arm during meetings. She saw the way Marcus looked at Jade, like she was a prize he wanted to win. The dynamic in the house shifted from cold neglect to open hostility. Marcus began to openly mock Isabella's contributions. He would come home from the office, smelling of Jade's perfume, and complain that Isabella was holding him back with her caution and her safety checks. He started calling her boring. He stopped wearing his wedding ring, claiming it was uncomfortable while he was typing. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. Isabella was organizing Marcus's home office, trying to be the supportive wife despite the growing distance, when she found a receipt crumbled up in his jacket pocket. It was from a high-end jeweler downtown. The receipt was for a diamond tennis bracelet worth $50,000. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. For a split second, she thought maybe Marcus was planning a surprise for their upcoming anniversary, a way to apologize for his recent behavior. But later that evening, watching the local news, she saw a clip of Marcus and Jade leaving a restaurant. As Jade raised her hand to block the camera flash, the light caught the sparkle of a brand new diamond bracelet on her wrist. It was identical to the one on the receipt. Isabella didn't cry. She didn't throw a vase against the wall. She just sat there in the dark, feeling the last bit of love she had for her husband evaporate, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She realized then that there was no us anymore. There was only a thief and his victim. The silence in the house was heavy, the kind that presses against your eardrums before a thunderstorm breaks. Isabella waited until Marcus came home the next evening. She didn't scream or cry. She simply sat in the living room, the receipt for the diamond bracelet resting on the coffee table like a loaded gun. When Marcus walked in, still on his phone, he barely glanced at her until he saw the piece of paper. He stopped mid-sentence, hung up the call, and stared at it. There was no apology in his eyes, only annoyance. He looked at her as if she were an employee who had stepped out of line. He didn't even try to deny it. He simply poured himself a drink and asked her what she intended to do about it. Isabella stood up, her voice trembling slightly, but her resolve like steel. She told him that she wanted a divorce. She explained that she wasn't going to make a scene or drag his name through the mud in the press, but she wanted what was fair. She wanted half of the company she helped build, and she wanted credit for the code she wrote. It was a reasonable request. She had been the architect of his success, the silent partner who did all the heavy lifting while he took the blows. She thought she was negotiating with a husband who, despite his flaws, still had a shred of decency left. She was wrong. Marcus laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He walked over to her, towering over her small frame, and leaned in close. He told her that she was delusional. He said that to the world. She was nothing but a housewife who got lucky. He reminded her that every patent, every copyright, and every asset was in his name. He told her that if she tried to leave him, he would bury her in legal fees until she was homeless. But as he spoke, Isabella saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. It was brief, but it was there. Marcus realized in that moment that a divorce would mean discovery. Lawyers would subpoena the source code. They would depose him. They would ask him technical questions he couldn't answer. If Isabella left him, she wouldn't just take half his money. She would expose him as a fraud to the entire world. The Elon Musk image he had carefully crafted would shatter instantly. He realized he couldn't let her leave. He couldn't just pay her off, because as long as she was free, she was a threat. She knew the truth. She knew he was a fake. As he looked at her, the calculation in his eyes shifted from bullying to something much darker. He realized that for him to survive as the king of Titan Motors, Isabella had to be removed from the board entirely. He finished his drink, looked at her with a terrifying calmness, and told her that they would discuss the terms of their separation in the morning. He lied. He knew there would be no discussion. He had already decided that by tomorrow morning, Isabella wouldn't be a wife asking for a divorce. She would be a criminal fighting for her freedom. Once Isabella went to bed, locking her door for the first time in their marriage, Marcus didn't go to sleep. He went to work. He called Jade, and within the hour, she was at the house, entering through the back door like a thief. Together, they sat in Marcus's home office, plotting the destruction of the woman sleeping upstairs. It was a surgical operation. They needed a crime that would not only send Isabella to prison, but also discredit her character so completely that no one would ever believe her if she tried to claim ownership of the code. They settled on corporate espionage. It was the perfect narrative. It played into the sexist stereotype of the scorned, irrational woman trying to hurt her successful husband. Jade took the lead on the technical fabrication. She was savvy enough to know how to plan a trail. She accessed Isabella's personal laptop remotely and began transferring thousands of sensitive files, blueprints for the new Titan X battery, confidential investor lists, and the source code itself, onto a cloud server. But she didn't stop there. She created a trail of fake emails from Isabella's account to a known competitor in China. The emails were damning. They were written to sound desperate and greedy, with Isabella supposedly demanding millions of dollars in cryptocurrency in exchange for the stolen data. Jade laughed as she typed them out, mocking Isabella's voice. Marcus watched, feeling a twisted sense of relief. He wasn't thinking about the woman he had married 5 years ago. He was thinking about his stock price. He convinced himself that he was the victim here. He told himself that Isabella had forced his hand by threatening to leave. He viewed this setup not as a betrayal, but as a necessary business decision, like cutting costs or firing underperforming staff. By 4 a.m., the frame-up was complete. The digital fingerprints were everywhere. The evidence was overwhelming. The next morning, Marcus woke up and acted like everything was normal. He made coffee. He even asked Isabella if she wanted a cup. He watched her drink it, knowing that in less than 2 hours, federal agents would be kicking down the front door. He needed to make sure she stayed in the house. He told her he had thought about what she said and that he wanted to stay home that morning to talk things through calmly. It was the final trap. He kept her there, giving her a false sense of hope that maybe they could resolve this civilly, all while checking his watch every 5 minutes, waiting for the sirens that would signal the end of her life. He kissed her on the forehead before he went to the balcony to wait, a Judas kiss that sealed her fate. The sound wasn't a knock, it was a battering ram. The front door of the mansion splintered open with a crash that shook the entire house. Isabella jumped from the sofa, spilling her coffee, her heart hammering against her ribs. Before she could even process the noise, the foyer was swarming with men in windbreakers emblazoned with FBI. They moved with terrifying speed, guns drawn, shouting commands that blurred into a wall of noise. Hands in the air. Get down. Do it now. Isabella froze. She was confused, thinking perhaps there had been a mistake, or maybe a threat against Marcus. She turned to look for him, to see if he was safe. An agent grabbed her arm, spinning her around and forcing her face down onto the expensive rug. The roughness of it shocked her. She tried to ask what was happening, but they were reading her rights. Isabella Thorne, you are under arrest for the theft of trade secrets, wire fraud, and industrial sabotage. The words didn't make sense. Theft. She owned the secrets. She wrote the code. It was like being arrested for stealing your own diary. As they pulled her up and cuffed her hands behind her back, the reality of the situation began to piece itself together in her mind. The timing. The fake emails the agents were already mentioning. The sudden arrival of the authorities just hours after she asked for a divorce. She was dragged out the front door, stumbling in her heels. The rain had started to fall, cold and biting. That was when she looked up. She expected to see Marcus in handcuffs too, or at least arguing with the agents. Instead, she saw the scene that would haunt her nightmares for the next 5 years. Marcus was standing on the balcony, safely above the chaos. He looked down at her with an expression of practiced sadness, shaking his head slowly, as if he couldn't believe she would do such a thing. It was a performance for the agents and the neighbors. But then, for a split second, the mask slipped. As the agents pushed Isabella toward the car, she locked eyes with him. He stopped shaking his head. The sadness vanished, replaced by a cold, triumphant smirk. He gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible wink. In that microsecond, the heartbreak vanished, and a cold clarity washed over Isabella. She realized everything. The receipt, the delay, the sudden desire to talk. This morning, it was all a setup. He hadn't just cheated on her, he had orchestrated her demise. The love she had felt for him instantly calcified into something hard and sharp. As the door slammed shut, cutting off her view of the monster she had married, Isabella didn't cry. She stopped shaking. She sat in the dark, wet back seat and made a silent vow. He had won the battle, but he had no idea he had just armed his enemy for the war. The interrogation room was designed to break people. It was a windowless box painted a sickly shade of beige, smelling of ammonia and despair. Isabella sat at the metal table, her hands still cuffed, shivering in her damp clothes. Across from her sat 2 federal agents who looked at her not with suspicion, but with certainty. To them, the case was already closed. They spread photographs across the table like a winning poker hand. There were screenshots of the emails Jade had forged, bank transfer records showing cryptocurrency moving into a wallet Isabella had never seen, and logs of the file transfers from her laptop. The lead agent, a man with tired eyes and a coffee stain on his tie, tapped the table and told her that they had her dead to rights. He explained that stealing proprietary technology from a defense contractor, which Titan Motors technically was due to their government grants, was treason. He told her she was looking at 20 years in a federal supermax. Isabella tried to speak, her voice raspy from shock. She tried to explain that she couldn't steal the technology because she was the one who created it. She told them to look at the source code, to look at the metadata, to check the keyboard logs from the nights the code was written. But the agents just exchanged a look of weary amusement. They told her that according to the patent filings and the corporate charter, Marcus Thorne was the sole inventor. They treated her claim of authorship like the desperate lie of a delusional narcissist. They didn't see a genius engineer. They saw a trophy wife trying to take credit for her husband's brilliance to save her own skin. Then the door opened, and a lawyer walked in. For a brief moment, Isabella felt a surge of hope. She thought Marcus had sent someone to clear this up, to tell the truth. But the man who sat down next to her wasn't there to defend her innocence. He was there to manage the damage. He introduced himself as the head of legal for Titan Motors. He didn't ask her if she did it. He opened his briefcase and laid out a plea deal. He spoke in a low, soothing voice, telling her that the evidence was overwhelming and a trial would be a public massacre. He said that Marcus was devastated but wanted to spare her the humiliation of a long prison sentence. The lawyer laid out the trap. If she pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of mishandling corporate data, she would get 5 years. If she fought it, the company would unleash its full legal might against her, and she would likely die in prison. But there was a catch. The plea deal required her to sign a new, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. She had to agree never to discuss the internal workings of Titan Motors or claim ownership of any intellectual property. If she tried to tell the truth about the code in court, she would be violating the NDA she signed upon marriage, adding civil lawsuits to her criminal charges. She was checkmated. Marcus had used the legal system to gag her. If she spoke the truth, she got 20 years. If she lied and admitted guilt, she got 5. She looked at the lawyer, then at the mirror where she knew eyes were watching, and realized her intelligence was no match for their bureaucracy. She picked up the pen, her hand trembling, and signed her life away, accepting the title of thief to save her future. The trial was less of a legal proceeding and more of a public execution. Every day for 3 weeks, the courthouse steps were packed with screaming protesters and hungry reporters. The narrative had taken hold completely. The public despised Isabella. They saw her as the ultimate villain, a wealthy, privileged woman who had bitten the hand that fed her. They held signs calling her a gold digger and a traitor. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. Isabella sat silently next to her court-appointed defense attorney, who seemed more interested in the book deal he would get after the trial than in actually defending her. She wore the plain gray suits they told her to wear, looking small and defeated, while the prosecution painted a portrait of a monster. The climax of the theater came when Marcus took the stand. He was the star witness, the grieving genius. He wore a sharp black suit and looked exhausted, a calculated choice to garner sympathy. He wiped away fake tears as he described the betrayal. He told the jury that he had trusted Isabella with his life's work, that he had shared his dreams with her, and that she had sold him out for a payout. He looked directly at the jury, his voice cracking with perfect dramatic timing, and said he didn't care about the money. He cared about the breach of trust. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. Sitting in the front row, Jade watched him with a small, satisfied smirk, scribbling notes on a legal pad. She was wearing a modest dress, playing the role of the loyal assistant holding the company together while the boss fell apart. Isabella wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and shout the command lines of the kernel code that only she knew. She wanted to ask Marcus to explain how the neural network processed LiDAR data. She knew he couldn't answer, but she stayed silent. She remembered the plea deal. She remembered the 20-year threat. She realized that fighting him now, in his arena, was suicide. She had to wait. She had to let him win today, so she could destroy him later. She watched him lie under oath, realizing that his arrogance was total. He truly believed he could run the company without her. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in cheers. The judge, a stern man who clearly bought into the media narrative, looked down at Isabella with disgust. He lectured her on loyalty and greed before handing down the sentence: 60 months in a federal correctional facility. As the bailiffs moved in to cuff her, the room buzzed with energy. Marcus stood up, buttoning his jacket, looking like a man who had just survived a war. He started to turn away, ready to face the cameras outside. But as Isabella was led past the plaintiff's table, she stopped. The bailiff tugged at her arm, but she planted her feet. She looked straight at Marcus. He paused, expecting her to beg or curse him. Instead, she leaned in, her voice barely a whisper, but clear enough for him to hear over the noise of the gallery. She didn't say, "I hate you." She didn't say, "You're a liar." She looked him dead in the eye and said, "Don't forget to update the system, Marcus." Marcus frowned, confused for a split second, before brushing it off as the ramblings of a desperate woman. He didn't know he had just been given the expiration date of his empire. The sound of the gavel hitting the wood was final, a sharp crack that severed Isabella's life into two distinct parts. Everything before today, and the long, dark tunnel she was about to enter. 60 months. 5 years. To the people in the courtroom, it sounded like a standard punishment for a white-collar crime. To Marcus, watching from the gallery with a solemn, practiced expression, it sounded like a victory lap. He had bought himself 5 years of silence. 5 years to erase her name from the company history books and cement his legacy as the sole genius behind Titan Motors. But to Isabella, standing stiffly as the bailiff took her arm, the number 60 months held a completely different meaning. It wasn't just a sentence, it was a timer. She was let out a side door, away from the flashing cameras that were waiting for Marcus on the front steps. She could hear the muffled roar of the crowd outside, chanting his name. The hero, the victim, the man who had survived betrayal. Inside the holding cell, the air was cold and smelled of rust. Isabella sat on a metal bench, listening to the muted sound of a television in the guard station down the hall. A news anchor was breathless with excitement, reporting that with the spy finally behind bars, Titan Motors stock had jumped 12% in after-hours trading. The market loved a clean resolution. They loved certainty. Isabella closed her eyes and did the math in her head. The code she had written, the Titan Protocol, was hardwired with a security certificate that required manual renewal every 5 years, down to the second. If she had been sentenced to 4 years, she would have been released in time to save him. If she had been sentenced to 10, the company would have collapsed while she was still inside. But 5 years? It was cosmic irony. It was surgical precision. The date of her release would align almost perfectly with the expiration of the system's security key. As they loaded her into the transport van, shackling her ankles to the floor, Isabella watched the city skyline retreat through the wire mesh window. She saw the Titan Motors skyscraper towering over the city, the logo glowing blue in the night sky. It looked invincible. It looked permanent. Marcus was probably up there right now, popping champagne, toasting to the future. He didn't know that the skyscraper was built on a foundation of sand. He didn't know that the woman in the back of the prison bus, the woman he thought he had discarded, was the only thing keeping the lights on. She wasn't going to prison to rot. She was going there to wait. The judge thought he was punishing her by taking away her freedom, but he had actually given her the ultimate weapon, time. She leaned her head against the vibrating wall of the van and let a small, cold smile touch her lips. Let the clock run. The Federal Correctional Institution was a world stripped of color. Everything was gray, the walls, the floors, the sky through the high, barred windows. The only splash of brightness was the abrasive orange of the jumpsuits. For Isabella, whose life had been defined by the sleek, minimalist aesthetics of modern technology and high-fashion galas, the sensory deprivation was a shock to the system. The processing was dehumanizing. She was stripped, searched, and scrubbed. Her expensive haircut was unevenly chopped back to regulation length. They took her name, Isabella Thorne, and replaced it with a number printed on a plastic ID card. In the span of an afternoon, the Queen of Silicon Valley was reduced to inmate 8940. Her cell was a 6x8 concrete box that she shared with a woman named Miller, a former accountant serving time for embezzlement. Miller was quiet, broken by the system, and warned Isabella on the first night to keep her head down, do her time, and never look the lifers in the eye. But prison has its own hierarchy, and weakness is a beacon. It didn't take long for the other inmates to recognize the famous face from the news. They didn't see a tech genius. They saw a spoiled rich girl who had fallen from grace. They saw prey. The first confrontation happened in the cafeteria 3 days in. Isabella was carrying her tray to an empty table when a large woman stepped into her path. It was Big T, a notorious enforcer within the cell block who ran the contraband trade. Big T knocked the tray out of Isabella's hands. The plastic clattered loudly against the floor, silencing the room. Peas and watery mashed potatoes splattered across Isabella's shoes. Big T smiled, waiting for the rich girl to cry or scream. She wanted a show. She wanted to establish dominance early. Isabella didn't look at the mess on the floor. She looked up, meeting Big T's gaze with the same analytical detachment she used when debugging code. She didn't square up to fight. She would lose that battle instantly. Instead, she used her only weapon, information. In the days prior, Isabella had been listening. She had observed the guards, the shift changes, and the subtle exchanges of packets in the yard. She leaned in close, ignoring the looming physical threat, and spoke quietly. She mentioned a specific date and time she had observed Big T slipping a guard a wad of cash near the laundry chutes. She noted that the cameras in that hallway had a blind spot, but the reflection in the supervisor's office window didn't. "I can calculate the exact angle of that reflection," Isabella whispered, her voice steady. "I can tell you exactly when the warden walks by. I can help you maximize your efficiency, or I can anonymously drop a note about the laundry schedule." Big T froze. The smile vanished. She looked at Isabella, really looked at her, and saw something dangerous. This wasn't a scared housewife. This was a calculator with a heartbeat. Big T stepped back, nodded once, and walked away. The cafeteria went back to its noise. Isabella bent down, picked up her tray, and sat down. She had survived the first test. She realized then that prison wasn't so different from the corporate world Marcus loved. It was just honest about its brutality. She could survive this. She just had to turn the prison into her new operating system. While Isabella learned to navigate the gray concrete maze of federal prison, Marcus Thorne was busy repainting the world in his own image. With his wife gone and the spy narrative firmly established, he was no longer just a CEO. He was a martyr and a visionary. The media adored him. They ran puff pieces about how he was rebuilding his life after the heartbreaking betrayal by the woman he loved. Titan Motors stock didn't just recover, it skyrocketed. The release of the Titan X sedan was a global phenomenon, and Marcus took every ounce of credit. He appeared on the covers of tech magazines, often with Jade by his side. They were the new power couple, dripping in diamonds and arrogance, hosting galas in the very house Isabella had designed. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with just being the face of the company. He wanted to be the undisputed brain, too. For years, he had harbored a deep insecurity about the engineering team. He knew they were loyal to Isabella. They were the ones who had pulled all-nighters with her, the ones who understood the elegance of her code. Every time Marcus walked into the server room, he felt their judgment. They knew he was a fraud. They knew he couldn't code his way out of a paper bag. So 6 months after Isabella's sentencing, Marcus initiated a corporate restructuring. It was a bloodbath. He fired the entire core engineering team, the people who actually understood how the cars worked, and replaced them with a fresh crop of young, hungry graduates from Ivy League schools. He chose these new engineers not for their skill, but for their obedience. They didn't know the history. They looked at Marcus with awe, believing the myth that he was the original architect. When they asked for the documentation on the core operating system, Marcus waved them off, telling them the system was perfect and didn't need tinkering. He told them their job was to focus on aesthetics, user interfaces, and flashy features that would look good in commercials. He essentially fired the mechanics and hired interior decorators. He surrounded himself with yes men who applauded his every idea, no matter how ridiculous. He felt invincible. He had erased Isabella's fingerprints from the building, removed the witnesses to his incompetence, and surrounded himself with a choir of praise. He truly believed that the hard part was over. He didn't realize that by firing the old guard, he had just fired the only people who might have been able to read the warning signs that were about to start flashing on the dashboard. Inside the prison, time moved differently. It wasn't measured in hours or minutes, but in the slow, grinding rhythm of the head count buzzer. For the first year, Isabella struggled. The isolation was suffocating for a mind used to processing a million variables a second. But eventually, she found a new purpose. She petitioned for a transfer to work in the prison library. It was a dusty, underfunded room filled with outdated encyclopedias and romance novels with missing pages, but it was quiet. It became her sanctuary. While other inmates grouped up in the yard to gossip or fight, Isabella sat in the corner of the library, reading every book she could find on contract law, corporate finance, and historical military strategy. She wasn't just passing time. She was sharpening her blade. By the second year, the outside world began to fade, but she kept tabs on it through the newspapers she was allowed to read. She saw the photos of Marcus and Jade in the society pages. She saw the headlines about Titan Motors' record profits. It stung, but she forced herself to feel the pain, using it as fuel. She visualized the code of the Titan protocol in her head every single night, running through the lines, checking for errors, confirming the date of the expiration. It was her nightly prayer. She had to make sure she hadn't made a mistake. She replayed the logic of the dead man's switch over and over, assuring herself that the math was perfect. Then came the envelope. It was thick, creamy paper with the letterhead of a prestigious law firm. Divorce papers. Marcus hadn't even the courage to serve them himself or send a personal note. It was a standard, cold legal filing citing irreconcilable differences and referencing the prenuptial agreement that he had successfully voided due to her criminal conviction. The terms were brutal. She would get nothing. No alimony, no stock options, no claim to the house. She was being stripped of everything she had brought into the marriage. The lawyer's cover letter suggested that she sign quickly to avoid further embarrassment. Isabella sat at the scarred wooden table in the library, holding the pen. A younger Isabella might have cried. She might have torn the papers up and demanded a fight. But inmate 8940 was different. She knew that fighting for money now was a waste of energy. Money was temporary. Destruction was permanent. She signed the papers with a steady hand. She didn't hesitate. By signing, she was giving Marcus exactly what he wanted, a clean break. She was letting him think he had won completely. She knew that his arrogance would balloon even further once he held this piece of paper. He would feel safe. And a man who feels safe is a man who stops looking over his shoulder. She sealed the envelope, handed it to the guard, and went back to reading her book. The trap was set. Now she just had to wait for him to walk into it. Year 3 marked the turning point, though at first, nobody noticed it. It started as a whisper in the machine. The Titan protocol was a living thing, designed to learn and adapt, but without its mother to guide it, the code began to drift. The first signs were trivial, almost comedic. Titan owners began posting on forums about strange quirks in their luxury vehicles. A doctor in Seattle reported that his heated seats would turn on to the maximum setting whenever he drove past a specific coffee shop. A lawyer in New York complained that her radio would blast classical music at full volume every time she put the car in reverse, and no amount of button mashing could turn it off. At Titan HQ, these reports were dismissed as user error. Marcus laughed them off in board meetings, joking that the cars just had personality. He told his new team of young engineers to push a software patch and fix it. But that was the problem. They couldn't. When the new engineers tried to access the deep subsystems to fix the radio bug, they hit a wall. The code was encrypted. It was Isabella's proprietary architecture, and because Marcus had fired everyone who knew how to navigate it, the new team was flying blind. They were like children trying to fix a nuclear reactor with a screwdriver. They patched over the surface, hiding the glitches with cosmetic updates, but the rot was spreading underneath. The glitches didn't stop, they evolved. The navigation system started taking people on bizarrely inefficient routes, adding 20 minutes to a commute for no reason. The automatic windows would roll down during car washes. The terrifying part was the randomness. It wasn't a consistent failure, it was chaotic. The code was becoming unstable. The dead man switch wasn't just a sudden kill command. It was a degradation algorithm. It was designed to slowly erode the system's efficiency as the deadline approached, a warning signal to the architect that maintenance was required. But the architect was in a cell, and the usurper was too busy planning his next yacht party to notice that the foundation of his castle was turning into mud. Marcus started getting annoyed. He screamed at his VP of engineering, demanding to know why they couldn't fix a simple radio bug. The VP, terrified of losing his high-paying job, lied. He told Marcus it was just a hardware compatibility issue with the supplier and that it was under control. Marcus bought the lie because he wanted to believe it. He didn't understand that software is unforgiving. He didn't understand that the code was crying out for its creator. He ignored the tremors, confident that his brand was too big to fail, unaware that these minor annoyances were the first rumbles of an earthquake that would swallow him whole. While the glitches in the cars were dismissed as minor quirks, the glitch in the public consciousness was fully patched over. By the fourth year of Isabella's sentence, she wasn't just forgotten. She was erased. The media had a new darling, and her name was Jade. The transition had been seamless. Jade had rebranded herself from the aggressive PR director to the compassionate philanthropist. She took over every charity initiative Isabella had founded. She sat on the boards of the arts councils and the children's hospitals, wearing modest, elegant clothing that mimicked Isabella's old style almost perfectly. The press ate it up. They named her Woman of the Year. Magazines ran spreads on her visionary leadership at Titan Motors, crediting her with the company's polished public image. In one particularly gut-wrenching interview, Jade sat in the living room of the Thorne estate, Isabella's living room, and told the reporter how hard it had been to clean up the mess left behind by the previous administration. She didn't name Isabella, but the implication was clear. She spoke about bringing integrity back to the company. Marcus sat beside her, nodding solemnly, playing the supportive partner. To the world, they were the saviors of the brand. But the erasure went deeper than just magazines. One afternoon, while redecorating the home office to make it more suitable for her photo shoots, Jade stumbled upon an old, leather-bound notebook tucked behind a row of books. It was Isabella's original coding journal. It was filled with handwritten algorithms, flowcharts, and the foundational logic of the Titan OS. It was essentially the manual for the entire company. Jade flipped through it, seeing only gibberish and scribbles. To her, it looked like the ramblings of a crazy person. She didn't see the value. She didn't see the salvation of the company in those pages. She just saw clutter. With a sneer, she tossed the notebook into the fireplace, striking a match. As the pages curled and blackened in the flames, the only physical record of how to fix the decaying system turned to ash. Jade dusted off her hands, feeling productive, completely unaware that she had just burned the only lifeboat on the Titanic. Year 4. The quirks were no longer funny. The degradation algorithm had moved from the entertainment systems to the drivetrain. The reports coming into Titan HQ were now genuinely alarming. A Titan SUV in Chicago had suddenly accelerated while in park, smashing through a garage door. A fleet of Titan delivery vans in London had simultaneously shut down on the highway, causing a massive traffic jam. The NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, opened a preliminary investigation. The stock price took a hit, wobbling for the first time in years. Inside the executive suite, panic was starting to set in. Marcus was screaming. He threw a tablet across the boardroom when the VP of engineering told him they still couldn't locate the source of the errors. "It's software," Marcus yelled. "Just rewrite it." But they couldn't. The Titan OS was a black box. The new code they tried to layer on top was being rejected by the core kernel like a body rejecting a transplanted organ. The engineers were baffled. They could see the code executing, but they couldn't see why. It was as if the car had a mind of its own, and it was getting angry. Deep in the server logs, buried under millions of lines of data, a single warning message began to generate. It wasn't visible on the dashboard yet, only to someone with root access, which no one had. The message was simple and terrifying. Critical update required. Security certificate expiring. 365 days remaining. It was the doomsday clock. The system was warning its master that the end was coming. It was calling out for the digital key that only Isabella possessed. But nobody was listening. Marcus ordered a massive PR campaign to drown out the negative news. He bribed regulators. He blamed suppliers. He did everything except the one thing that could save him. Admit he didn't know how his own product worked. He was plugging holes in a dam with $100 bills, not realizing the water was about to crest over the top. Desperate to distract the world from the failing cars and the sinking stock price, Marcus decided to go bigger. If he couldn't fix the ground, he would conquer the sky. He announced the launch of Titan Aerospace. It was a classic magician's trick. Look at this shiny new thing over here so you don't notice the mess over there. He called a press conference and unveiled the concept for the Titan Sky, a fully autonomous, passenger-carrying drone taxi. He promised it would revolutionize urban travel. He showed slick CGI videos of drones whisking people from rooftops to airports in minutes. The investors, hungry for the next big thing, swallowed the bait. The stock price rebounded. Marcus was drunk on his own hype. He set a date for the official prototype reveal and live demonstration. He wanted it to be the biggest event in tech history. He wanted the whole world watching. He looked at the calendar to pick a date. He wanted it to be symbolic, a new beginning. He chose a date exactly 1 year from the announcement. It was a date that sent a chill down the spine of the few people who remembered the past. It was the exact day Isabella was scheduled to be released from prison. Marcus didn't do this by accident. It was a final, petty act of dominance. He wanted to ensure that on the day Isabella walked free, penniless and disgraced, her release would be buried in the news cycle by his greatest triumph. He wanted her to step out of prison and see his face on every screen in Times Square. He wanted to overshadow her freedom with his glory. He grinned as he circled the date on his digital calendar, thinking he was writing the headline of his success. He had no idea he had just scheduled his own funeral. He had just invited the world to watch him stand on a stage powered by a system that was set to self-destruct on that very afternoon. 1 week before Isabella's release date, the routine of the prison was broken by an unexpected summons. A guard told her she had a visitor. Isabella wasn't expecting anyone. Her parents had passed away years ago, and her friends from the old life had abandoned her the moment the handcuffs went on. She walked into the visitation room, her heart beating a steady, calm rhythm. She sat down on the metal stool on her side of the thick plexiglass divider. On the other side, looking out of place in his bespoke Italian suit and $1,000 loafers, was Marcus. He looked older. The stress of managing a crumbling empire was starting to show in the gray at his temples and the tightness around his eyes, but his arrogance remained untouched. He picked up the receiver, offering her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't come to apologize. He came to negotiate. Marcus got straight to the point. He told her that he knew she was getting out soon, and he wanted to make sure her transition was smooth. He slid a piece of paper against the glass. It was a photocopy of a cashier's check for $2 million. He called it a severance package, but there were strings attached. He told her that in exchange for the money, she had to sign a document agreeing to move to Europe and never speak to the press. He wanted her gone. He was terrified that she would go on a talk show and tell the world how he had treated her. He was worried about his reputation, about the Titan Sky launch next week. He wanted to buy her silence, just like he bought everything else. Isabella looked at the check, then up at Marcus. She didn't touch the glass. She leaned into the microphone and spoke softly. She asked him if the check was drawn from the Titan Motors operating account. Marcus, confused, said yes. Isabella smiled. A genuine, chilling smile that made Marcus shift in his seat. She told him to keep the money. She said she didn't need his charity because where she was going, she wouldn't need cash. Marcus got angry then. He accused her of being ungrateful. He told her she would be a convicted felon with no job prospects, a pariah in the industry. He told her she would be begging him for help in a month. Isabella just shook her head. She told him she would be watching the live stream of the gala. She told him she wouldn't miss it for the world. Marcus slammed the receiver down and stormed out, telling himself she was just a bitter, broken woman. He didn't notice that for the first time in 5 years, she was the one holding the power in the room. The morning of the release was gray and overcast, the sky matching the mood of the heavy iron gates that stood between Isabella and the rest of the world. The process was slow. She exchanged her orange jumpsuit for the clothes she had been wearing the night she was arrested. A pair of designer jeans that were now out of style, and a silk blouse that smelled faintly of mildew from sitting in an evidence bag for half a decade. She signed the final paperwork, received a debit card with the $40 she had earned working in the library, and walked toward the exit. The heavy steel door buzzed loudly and clicked on lock. It was the sound of a cage opening. Isabella stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air tasted different. It tasted like gasoline and rain, but to her, it tasted like oxygen. She looked around the empty parking lot. In movies, there is always someone waiting, a friend leaning against a car, a lover with open arms. For Isabella, there was only empty asphalt and a stray dog sniffing at a trash can. Marcus had ensured she had no one left. But Isabella didn't look sad. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a cheap, prepaid burner phone she had bought from another inmate the day before. She turned it on, her fingers dancing over the keypad with a familiarity she hadn't felt in years. She dialed a number that wasn't saved in her contacts, a number she had memorized 10 years ago. It rang once. A voice on the other end picked up immediately. It was a computerized voice, synthesized and cold. Identity confirmed, it said. Accessing secure storage protocol. Locker 402 is active. Isabella hung up. She didn't need a ride. She began to walk down the long road toward the bus stop, her heels clicking on the pavement. She walked with a purpose that made the few passing cars slow down to look. She wasn't a drifting ex-con. She was a soldier marching to the front lines. She checked the time on the burner phone. It was 9 a.m. The Titan Aerospace Gala began at 6 p.m. She had 9 hours to prepare for the funeral of her husband's career. Isabella took 3 buses to get to a nondescript self-storage facility on the outskirts of the city. It was a place where people stored old furniture and forgotten memories, the kind of place that didn't ask questions if you paid in cash. She found Unit 402. She punched in a code, the date of her wedding to Marcus, a bitter reminder she used as a password. The roller door rattled up. Inside, sitting on a single wooden pallet, was a black, waterproof duffel bag. This was her go-bag. She had prepared it years ago, not for prison, but for a natural disaster. She had hidden it here and paid the lease automatically through a shell company she set up before the marriage turned sour. It was the only asset Marcus's lawyers hadn't found because it wasn't digital, it was physical. She unzipped the bag. Inside was $20,000 in cash, a change of clothes, and most importantly, her laptop. It wasn't a sleek consumer model. It was a heavy, military-grade machine with custom processors she had modified herself. She sat on the cold concrete floor and opened the lid. The screen flickered to life. She plugged in a wireless dongle and connected to the internet. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She wasn't checking email. She was pinging the Titan protocol server. The screen filled with green text. System status, critical. Admin access required. Isabella let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It was still there. The back door was still open. The countdown clock was displayed in the corner of her screen. T-minus 8 hours and 45 minutes. She had 8 hours and 45 minutes before the system purged itself. She stood up and grabbed the rest of the gear. She went to a nearby motel, paid for a room for an hour, and showered. She scrubbed the prison off her skin. She washed her hair, watching the gray water swirl down the drain. Then, she dressed. She put on the outfit she had stashed in the bag, a sharp, white tailored suit. It was a power suit. It was armor. She looked in the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't inmate 8940. The fear was gone. The hesitation was gone. Her eyes were hard and focused. She applied a layer of red lipstick, the color of war. She packed the laptop into a leather satchel and walked out of the motel room. She hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address of the convention center. The driver looked at her in the rearview mirror, impressed by her aura. "Big night?" he asked. Isabella looked out the window at the passing city, seeing the Titan Motors billboards everywhere. "You have no idea," she said. "The biggest." "You are absolutely right. To truly capture the weight of this revenge, we need to slow down and let the tension breathe. We need to feel the opulence of the enemy and the cold, calculated rage of the protagonist." The Titan Aerospace Gala was not just a party. It was a coronation ceremony disguised as a product launch. The convention center, a massive structure of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district, had been transformed into a futuristic temple dedicated to the ego of one man. Massive holographic projectors lined the red carpet, beaming three-dimensional schematics of the Titan sky drone into the night air, bathing the arriving guests in a wash of electric blue light. It was a display of wealth so obscene that it felt like a deliberate insult to the woman who had spent the last 5 years staring at a gray concrete wall. The line of vehicles waiting to drop off the city's elite was a parade of excess. Armored SUVs, stretch limousines, and sleek hypercars that cost more than the GDP of a small nation. Marcus Thorne stood at the entrance like a king greeting his subjects, his tuxedo tailored to perfection, flashing that trademark charismatic smile that had charmed investors and fooled a wife. Beside him stood Jade, dripping in diamonds that caught the strobe of the paparazzi flashes, looking every bit the queen of the new empire. Into this sea of black tie and polished chrome rolled a battered yellow taxi with a squeaky suspension. It stopped awkwardly behind a Rolls-Royce, disrupting the flow of the arrival line. The doorman hesitated, unsure if they should wave it away, but before they could act, the rear door opened. Isabella stepped out. She didn't emerge tentatively like a broken ex-con. She stepped onto the red carpet with the precision of a blade sliding out of a sheath. She was wearing a stark white suit, sharp, tailored, and blindingly bright amidst the sea of dark tuxedos. It was a statement. In many cultures, white is the color of death, the color of a ghost returning to haunt the living. She wore no jewelry, no diamonds, and no makeup other than a slash of blood-red lipstick. She looked less like a guest and more like a reckoning. The reaction was immediate. The roar of the crowd dipped into a confused murmur. Heads turned. Whispers rippled down the line like a shockwave. People recognized her, but they couldn't reconcile the image of the disgraced spy from the tabloids with this vision of cold power walking toward them. The paparazzi, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, swung their heavy lenses away from Marcus and toward the woman in white. Isabella walked straight for the VIP checkpoint, her heels clicking a steady, ominous rhythm on the crimson carpet. She didn't look at the cameras. She kept her eyes locked on the heavy velvet ropes that separated the wolves from the sheep. Standing at the checkpoint was the head of security, a burly man named Miller who had worked for the Thorne family for a decade. He knew Isabella. He had driven her to the airport. He had carried her groceries. As she approached, his face went pale. He stepped forward, raising a hand to block her path, his eyes darting nervously toward the cameras. He began to stammer that this was a private event, that the guest list was strictly controlled, and that she needed to leave before he called the police. It was a bluff. He knew that dragging the CEO's ex-wife away in handcuffs on live television would be a PR disaster. Isabella didn't say a word. She simply reached into her small clutch and withdrew a heavy, cream-colored envelope embossed with gold leaf. It was a legitimate VIP invitation, purchased through 3 layers of shell companies and scalpers. She held it up to his face, her eyes boring into his. She dared him to deny it. She dared him to make a scene. Miller looked at the invitation, then back at Isabella's icy stare. He realized in that moment that he wasn't looking at the woman who left. He was looking at something entirely new. He lowered his hand, unhooked the velvet rope, and stepped aside, allowing the ghost to enter the machine. Crossing the threshold into the main hall was like stepping into a different universe. The air was cool and smelled of expensive champagne, rare orchids, and the metallic tang of ozone from the fog machines. The room was packed with 2,000 of the most powerful people in the technology sector, investors, politicians, and rivals who had come to kiss the ring of the new king. Isabella moved through the crowd with a fluid, predatory grace. She kept to the shadows of the massive pillars, observing the room like a wolf circling a flock of sheep. Everywhere she looked, she saw betrayal. She saw Arthur Vance, a board member she had personally mentored, laughing loudly at one of Marcus's jokes near the open bar. She saw the editor of the tech magazine that had smeared her reputation clinking glasses with jade. These were the people who had eaten at her table, drank her wine, and then cheered as she was dragged away in chains. The anger in her chest was a cold, solid thing, but she didn't let it show. She wasn't here to scream or throw a drink in someone's face. That was what the old Isabella might have done. This Isabella was here to execute a command. She navigated toward the rear of the cavernous hall, positioning herself near the shadowed alcove that housed the main technical booth. This was the nervous system of the entire event. Dozens of engineers were hunched over mixing boards and server racks, managing the complex audiovisual presentation that would broadcast Marcus's triumph to the world. They were too busy monitoring audio levels and lighting cues to notice the woman in the white suit leaning casually against the back wall, hidden by the darkness. Isabella slipped her hand into her sleek leather bag. She didn't pull out the laptop yet. That was the nuclear option. Instead, she retrieved the modified burner phone she had prepped in the motel room. It looked like a piece of junk, cheap plastic with a cracked screen, but the internals were military-grade. She activated the custom Wi-Fi sniffing program she had coded from memory in the prison library. The screen glowed with a cascade of green text as it scanned the invisible frequencies filling the room. It found the target almost immediately, Titan_core_vin_net. This was the closed network running the presentation, the lights, and most importantly, the prototype drone on the stage. She didn't need to guess the password. Marcus was arrogant, but he was also lazy. She knew that he never changed the root admin protocols because he didn't know how. She typed in a sequence of characters that she had embedded into the system's architecture 5 years ago, a backdoor key that acted like a master skeleton key for the entire network. Her thumb hovered over the execute button. The phone screen flashed. Connection established. Root access granted. She was in. She was now a digital ghost inside the machine, seeing everything, controlling everything. She checked the internal clock on the server. It was synced perfectly with real-time. The expiration date on the Titan protocol wasn't just a threat, it was a hard-coded reality. The countdown showed T-minus 10 minutes until critical system failure. Marcus was 10 minutes away from professional annihilation, and he was currently shaking hands with a senator, completely unaware that the woman standing 50 feet away held his life in the palm of her hand. The ambient music in the hall swelled to a cinematic crescendo, signaling the start of the show. The house lights dimmed, plunging the audience into darkness, save for the hundreds of glowing screens of smartphones held aloft to capture the moment. A single, blinding spotlight cut through the gloom and hit center stage. Marcus walked out to a thunderous applause that shook the floorboards. He looked magnificent in the harsh light, a titan of industry, a man who had supposedly conquered the impossible. He raised both hands, silencing the crowd with the practiced ease of a cult leader. Behind him, 3 massive IMAX-sized screens flickered to life, projecting his face in high definition, making him look like a god looking down on his subjects. He began to speak, his voice amplified by the massive sound system, booming in Isabella's chest. 5 years ago, Marcus began, pacing the stage with theatrical gravity. The critics told us we were dreaming. They said the technology was impossible. They said the vision was too big for one company. He paused, looking over the audience with a look of mock humility. Jade stood just off stage in the wings, visible on the side monitors, beaming with pride, playing the role of the devoted partner who had stood by him through the hard times. But I didn't listen, Marcus continued, his voice rising with passion. I knew that true innovation requires sacrifice. I built this code, this company, this future, with nothing but my own 2 hands and a belief in the impossible. Isabella, standing in the dark at the back of the room, felt a physical wave of nausea. He was stealing her words. He was stealing her sleepless nights, her anxiety, her brilliance. He was claiming he wrote the code. He was erasing her existence in real time. And tonight, Marcus shouted, reaching the climax of his speech, we don't just drive on the road. Tonight, we take to the skies. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Titan sky. He swept his arm dramatically toward the veiled prototype behind him. The music peaked. The crowd screamed. Marcus turned to face the giant screens, expecting a slick, pre-produced video to launch, showing the drone in action. But the video didn't play. Instead, a low, guttural sound began to emanate from the speakers. Not music, but a digital screech, like a modem dying in agony. The massive image of Marcus's face on the screen didn't fade to the video, it froze. Then, it began to distort. The pixels tore apart, stretching his smile into a grotesque, jagged grimace. The colors inverted, turning his skin purple and his eyes a demonic black. The audience gasped, the sound rippling through the room like a cold wind. Marcus tapped his microphone, confused, his smile faltering. A little technical glitch, he chuckled nervously, sweating under the spotlight. That's live TV for you. But the screen didn't reset. The distortion spread like a virus. The blue background of the Titan logo drained away, leaving a stark, terrified black void. And then, slowly, deliberately, a cursor appeared in the center of the giant screen. It was the size of a car, blinking with a rhythmic, menacing pulse. Blink, blink, blink. The system wasn't crashing. It was waking up. The expiration timer had hit 0, and the architect was knocking at the door. The confusion in the hall shifted rapidly from awkward amusement to genuine alarm. It wasn't just the screens. The glitch had physical consequences. On the center stage, the prototype Titan Sky drone, which had been levitating a few inches off its display stand using a magnetic suspension system to demonstrate its weightlessness, suddenly lost all power. It didn't drift down gracefully, it dropped like a stone. The heavy composite metal slammed onto the stage floor with a deafening, metallic clunk that echoed through the microphone, causing the front row of investors to jump in their seats. The sleek LED running lights that traced the curves of the machine flickered once and died, turning the futuristic marvel into a lifeless, gray lump of metal. Marcus stared at the dead machine, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He tapped his earpiece, frantically demanding answers from the control booth, but there was no response, only the hiss of static. But the disaster wasn't contained to the room. To demonstrate the global reach of the Titan network, Marcus had set up smaller satellite screens around the hall, broadcasting live feeds of Titan cars in major cities: Tokyo, London, New York. The intention was to show them gliding seamlessly through traffic. Instead, the audience watched in horror as the feed showed chaos. In London, a fleet of Titan delivery vans simultaneously slammed on their brakes in the middle of a roundabout. In New York, a luxury sedan froze in the middle of an intersection, its hazard lights flashing in a manic, synchronized rhythm. It was a global lockout. Every vehicle running the Titan protocol, hundreds of thousands of cars across the planet, had just received a command from the core kernel. It wasn't a crash, it was a parking brake. The doors locked. The engines cut. The touchscreens went black. Inside the convention center, the phones of the investors began to light up. Notifications were pouring in from news outlets and angry spouses. My car just died on the freeway. I'm locked inside my vehicle. The stock is dropping. The murmur in the crowd grew into a roar of panic. Marcus stood alone on the stage, the spotlight burning him, watching his empire turn into a paperweight in real time. He looked toward the tech booth, screaming without a microphone, his face twisted in rage, demanding they cut the feed. But they couldn't. The system wasn't listening to them anymore. It was listening to the ghost in the back of the room. The black void on the main IMAX screens didn't stay empty for long. The blinking cursor stopped, and the background shifted violently from black to a deep, arterial red. It was a color so intense it seemed to bleed out of the screens, bathing the entire convention hall in a hellish crimson glow. The expensive white tablecloths turned pink. The diamonds on the guests' necks reflected the color of blood. The room fell into a terrified silence as large, jagged white text began to type itself across the monitors, letter by letter, with a loud, mechanical keystroke sound that was amplified through the speakers. Error 404, identity mismatch. Administrator privileges revoked. Unauthorized user detected. Marcus Thorne. The gasp from the audience was audible. This wasn't a technical error. This was an accusation. The text continued to scroll, faster now, relentless. System integrity compromised. License expiration, today. Initiating total system purge in T-5 minutes. Panic erupted in the control booth. The engineers were frantically pulling cables, trying to kill the power to the screens, but the system had overridden the manual breakers. Isabella had routed the power through a looped command that locked the switches in the on position. They were locked out of their own building. On stage, Marcus looked small. The red light cast deep shadows on his face, making him look skeletal. He turned to Jade, looking for support, but she was staring at her phone, watching the Titan Motors stock ticker plummet in freefall. The purge message was the death knell. A system purge meant the deletion of the source code, the erasure of the intellectual property that gave the company its value. If that timer hit zero, Titan Motors wouldn't just be broken, it would be empty. It would be a trillion-dollar company with zero assets. Marcus spun around, looking wild-eyed at the crowd, shouting that this was a hack, a terrorist attack, a lie. But the red light didn't blink. It just stared at him, judging him. In the chaos of the red-washed room, a single beam of pure white light cut through the darkness. It wasn't part of the show. It was a manual spotlight, operated by a sympathetic lighting technician who had been part of the old crew, one of the few Isabella had treated with kindness years ago. He had seen her enter. He knew what to do. The beam bypassed the stage entirely and swept across the back of the room, searching, until it landed on the woman in the white suit. Isabella didn't flinch. As the light hit her, she stepped away from the wall. The contrast was striking. The room was bathed in the red of emergency and danger, but she stood in a column of pure, clean white light. She began to walk. She didn't run. She didn't rush. She walked with the slow, deliberate cadence of an executioner climbing the steps to the scaffold. The crowd, sensing the shift in energy, turned to look. As they recognized her, a path opened up. It was biblical. The sea of tuxedos and gowns parted, people scrambling to get out of her way, terrified and mesmerized by the aura of power radiating from her. Jade, seeing Isabella approaching the stage, snapped out of her shock. She saw her life crumbling, and her instinct was to fight. She rushed down the steps of the stage and planted herself in the center of the aisle, blocking Isabella's path. She looked desperate, her hair slightly askew, her face flushed with anger. She opened her mouth to scream, to call security, to insult the woman she had helped destroy. But Isabella didn't even slow down. She didn't break stride. She looked right through Jade as if she were made of glass, as if she were a ghost that didn't matter. The sheer force of Isabella's indifference was more violent than a slap. Jade, unnerved by the lack of reaction, faltered. She stepped back, stumbling in her heels, nearly falling into the lap of a board member. Isabella walked past her without a glance, the white fabric of her suit brushing against Jade's arm, the only contact she would ever grant her again. She ascended the stairs to the stage, the sound of her heels echoing in the silence, coming for the man who was trembling in the center of the red light. Isabella stepped onto the platform, the wooden boards creaking slightly under the silence of 2,000 held breaths. Marcus stood frozen, trapped in the glare of the red emergency lights, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of the very truck he had claimed to build. He made a weak, instinctive motion to reach for the microphone, perhaps to call for security or to try and spin this intrusion as part of the act, but his hand trembled so violently that he couldn't close his fingers around the stand. Isabella didn't struggle with him. She didn't shove him. She simply reached out with a calm, steady hand and took the microphone from his grip. It was a gentle motion, almost maternal, but the symbolism was violent. She was taking back her voice. She turned to face the crowd, and by extension, the cameras broadcasting to millions of viewers worldwide. The feedback loop from the speakers whined for a split second before settling into a crisp silence. Isabella didn't shout. She didn't scream or rage. When she spoke, her voice was low, clear, and terrifyingly composed. She told them that what they were witnessing wasn't a malfunction, and it certainly wasn't a terrorist attack. It was a foreclosure. She gestured to the red screens behind her, to the flashing text accusing Marcus of theft. She explained that the Titan Protocol was a living organism, a complex neural network that required a symbiotic relationship with its creator to survive. She revealed that 5 years ago, she had been removed from that ecosystem by force, framed by the man standing next to her, and sent to a cage while he took credit for her mind. The audience in the hall was paralyzed. The investors, who had spent years worshiping Marcus as a visionary, looked from the woman in white to the man cowering in the shadows, and the realization hit them like a physical blow. The lie was dissolving. Isabella reached into the pocket of her suit jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate. She pulled out a small, silver USB drive. It was unpretentious, something you could buy at an office supply store for $10, yet she held it up like it was a holy relic. She told them that this drive contained the security patch. It contained the biometric authorization key, her fingerprint, her retinal scan, her digital signature that would reset the clock. She explained that this tiny piece of metal was the only thing that could stop the system purge. It was the only thing that could unlock the cars stranded in intersections around the globe. It was the only thing that could save the billions of dollars of intellectual property from vanishing into the ether. She held the cure in her hand, and the entire room leaned forward, desperate for her to plug it in. The sight of the USB drive broke Marcus completely. The arrogance that had defined him for a decade, the armor of wealth and fame he wore like a second skin, evaporated in an instant. He looked at the countdown timer on the screen behind them, T-2 minutes. Then he looked at the drive in Isabella's hand. The math was simple. If she plugged it into the console on the podium, his company would live. If she didn't, he was ruined. He would be facing not just bankruptcy, but criminal negligence charges, lawsuits, and jail time for the chaos unfolding on the streets. The fear of prison, the very fate he had forced upon her, suddenly became his reality. In front of the world, Marcus Thorne fell apart. He dropped to his knees. It wasn't a stumble, it was a surrender. He grasped at the hem of Isabella's white trousers, his hands shaking, sweat dripping from his forehead onto the stage floor. The microphones picked up his desperate whispers. He begged her, He pleaded with her to stop the countdown. He offered her everything. "I'll give you half," he stammered, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I'll give you 50% of the stock. I'll put your name on the building. I'll tell them everything. Just save it, Bella. Please." It was a pathetic display. The Elon Musk of his generation was reduced to a weeping child, bargaining for a toy he had broken. Isabella looked down at him with an expression that was worse than hatred. It was indifference. She watched him grovel, listening to him offer her money that she had earned, offering her power that she already possessed. She looked out at the audience, at the board members who had let this happen, at Jade standing in the aisle with her hands over her mouth. Then, she looked back at the USB drive. She turned it over in her fingers, letting the stage lights catch the silver casing. She leaned down, bringing the microphone close to Marcus's ear so the whole world could hear her answer. She told him that he still didn't understand. She told him that she didn't want his money, because money was just paper. She didn't want the company, because the company was rotten. She whispered that he had sent her to hell for 5 years to build a castle on a foundation of lies, and she hadn't come back to move the furniture. She had come back to burn the house down. "You can't give me what is already mine, Marcus," she said softly. "And you can't buy time that has already run out." The silence that stretched across the convention hall was heavy enough to crush a man, but Marcus Thorne was already broken. He knelt on the stage, his expensive tuxedo trousers soaking up the sweat and grime of the floor, his eyes fixed on the small silver USB drive hovering just out of his reach. To him, and to the billions of dollars of investors watching in the room and online, that drive was not just plastic and silicon, it was oxygen. It was the only thing standing between the present moment and total, irreversible oblivion. Isabella held it between her thumb and forefinger, rotating it slowly, letting the stage lights dance off its metallic surface. She looked at the countdown timer, T-minus 10 seconds. The red light of the screens pulsed faster, mimicking the racing heartbeat of a dying giant. Then, with a casual flick of her wrist, Isabella opened her hand. She didn't plug the drive into the console. She didn't hand it to Marcus. She simply let gravity take over. The drive fell through the air in slow motion, tumbling end over end, before hitting the hardwood floor of the stage. It didn't make a loud noise, just a small, insignificant clatter, but in the acoustic perfection of the hall, it sounded like a gunshot. Marcus lunged for it, a desperate, animalistic scramble to save his life, but he was too slow. Before his fingers could graze the metal, Isabella raised her foot. She was wearing white stilettos with a heel sharp enough to puncture a tire. With a single, decisive motion, she brought her heel down directly onto the drive. The sound of the plastic casing shattering and the silicon chip snapping was sickeningly audible through the microphone. She didn't just step on it. She ground her heel into the floor, twisting her ankle to ensure that the memory chips were reduced to glittering dust. Marcus froze, his hand inches from her shoe, staring at the debris of his salvation. He let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream and not quite a sob, a guttural noise of pure despair. At that exact moment, the countdown timer on the massive IMAX screens hit 0. The result was instantaneous. The angry red warning text vanished, replaced by a terminal command prompt that read, "System purge executed." A loading bar appeared, filling rapidly from left to right. Deleting source code, deleting user data, deleting backup protocols. It was a digital wildfire. In the server room behind the stage, the lights on the racks turned from green to black. The fan spun down. The hum of the cooling systems died. On the satellite feeds, the chaos ended, but not in the way anyone hoped. The cars didn't unlock. They simply became bricks. The software that told the engine how to fire, the brakes how to release, and the doors how to open was gone. They were dead metal. And then came the financial impact. On the side monitors tracking the stock market, the ticker symbol for Titan Motors, TTN, began to freefall. It didn't just dip, it crashed. As the news of the purge hit the wires, that the company had literally lost its product, algorithms triggered massive sell-offs. The line on the graph went vertical, plunging from $300 a share to pennies in the span of 30 seconds. Billions of dollars in market cap evaporated into thin air. The audience in the room watched their portfolios vanish. Screams erupted from the floor, not of fear, but of financial ruin. The empire didn't just fall, it was deleted. The aftermath of the purge was a scene of absolute bedlam. The convention center, once a temple of order and luxury, descended into anarchy. Investors were shouting into their phones, trying to liquidate assets that no longer existed. Board members were shoving each other, trying to get to the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Titan brand. In the center of the storm, on the dark stage, Marcus Thorne remained on his knees, staring at the crushed remains of the USB drive. He was catatonic, unable to process the magnitude of his loss. He had woken up a billionaire. He would go to sleep with a net worth of negative millions, buried under a mountain of lawsuits and debt. Then, the doors at the back of the hall burst open. But this time, it wasn't a woman in a white suit. It was a squad of federal agents, the letters SEC and FBI emblazoned on their jackets. The irony was poetic. 5 years ago, Marcus had summoned them to arrest his wife to save his company. Now, the system he had manipulated had turned on him. They stormed the aisle, pushing past the fleeing guests. They weren't there for the technical glitch. They were there for the fraud. The live broadcast of the system failure had exposed the lie of his ownership, triggering an immediate warrant for securities fraud and criminal negligence. As they marched up the stairs to the stage, Jade, who had been watching from the aisle, made her move. She didn't run to Marcus to comfort him. She didn't stand by her man. She ripped the VIP lanyard from her neck, threw it on the ground, and sprinted toward the side exit, disappearing into the night like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. She knew the money was gone, and with it, her loyalty. Isabella stood calmly to the side as the agents hauled Marcus to his feet. He looked at her one last time, his eyes hollow, searching for some trace of mercy or regret. He found none. Isabella looked at him with the cool detachment of a scientist observing a failed experiment. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The destruction around them was her closing argument. As they cuffed him, using the same cold steel that had bound her wrists 5 years ago, Isabella turned her back on him. She walked down the stage steps, the crowd parting for her in terrified reverence. She walked out of the convention center, past the abandoned limousines and the confused paparazzi, and stepped into the cool night air. 6 months later, the headlines had moved on, but the landscape had changed forever. Titan Motors was liquidated, its assets sold for scrap. Marcus Thorne was awaiting trial in a cell much smaller than the one Isabella had occupied, facing a 20-year sentence. Jade was working as a hostess in a mid-tier restaurant, her reputation radioactive in the corporate world. And Isabella? She didn't retire. She launched Phoenix Tech, a new firm built on the ashes of the old. Her first product was a security patch that could unlock the millions of brick Titan cars, for a licensing fee, of course. She regained her fortune, her name, and her life, not by shouting the loudest, but by being the only one who knew how the machine truly worked. She had proven that while you can steal the crown, you can never steal the kingdom from the queen who built it.